Before today's episode, I want to ask for your interest. We'd like to open our Keep It Real episodes up to you, the listener, and have discussions on topics driven by the content of this podcast and our social media. If you're interested, we'd love to hear so by dropping us a message on our Instagram. Our handle is ResilientPPT, ResilientPPT. Thanks.
Welcome to the Resilient Performance Podcast. This is Keep It Real Talk number 8. We're going to be talking about butt winks with squatting, elevating the heels with squatting as our main topic this week. And we'll open it up for questions if we have any at the end. I'm Greg Spatz. We have Trevor Rappa here. We have Doug Kachigian. I believe this topic was sent in by Gerard Friedman. So that's awesome. Thanks for sending that in, Gerard. And let's get started. What do you guys got? How do we even start with this? It's a broad topic, but go for it.
Yeah, I mean, the butt winking with squatting comes up a lot. And it's one of those things that it becomes like a hysterical conversation. Like you should never butt wink or, butt winking is okay. And it's kind of the same debate. It's like the whole like movement optimality versus movement relativism. And I think that with any of this stuff, it always like avoid the extremes. If you study squatting, and it has been studied biomechanically in a lab, like no matter what your eye sees, when you get to a certain depth in the squat, a posterior pelvic tilt occurs, which we could call butt winking, and it's unavoidable. But I think in real life, most coaches, therapists have an idea of what they want a movement to look like. And if there's too much butt winking, I mean, we could talk about what that is. And I think maybe this isn't the best forum for it because it's more about like, if we were to watch videos, of people squatting, intuitively we would say, okay, like that's not bad, or that's too much. I think most coaches and therapists are using kind of the eye test. They have an idea of what they want a movement to look like, and when it comes to squatting, I mean, even the quote unquote best squatters, like a butt wink is going to occur, even in some cases a visible butt wink. But I think that and correct me if you guys have a different opinion, I think we would say that we don't want to see a ton of spinal movement under load where like somebody, let's say, starts out where they're visibly massively extended, when they unrack the bar, and then they descend to whatever depth they get to, and there's like this just crazy reversal like an accordion. So we're okay with some posterior tilt or butt winking. Again, it comes down to that eye test. I mean, I think that the videos that we post on YouTube and on Instagram are kind of a little bit more revealing as to what we consider a quote unquote good squat. In the context of the heel lifts, you're seeing that a lot more. And I think it's for the most part a good thing, because if people have an idea of what they want a squat to look like, and using that heel lift, whether it's like with a wedge or lifting shoes, reduces that spinal reversal to what the coach or therapist deems acceptable, then it's good. But with anything else, there's trade-offs. So we know that using a heel lift or a shoe is going to kind of buy somebody some dorsiflexion that they might not have, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, as long as if the athlete needs dorsiflexion, you're doing other things to address it. If you're saying, look, we want to use the squat because it's a great way to load the legs, you still, if you deem dorsiflexion important, you have to address it in other ways, if not via loaded squatting. And then anytime that you alter mechanics, you're altering where the stress goes. So we know that if we use a wedge or a shoe, we're basically moving the center of gravity forward. And most people, if they have an issue with squatting, like even somebody who might have good dorsiflexion, they might have poor hip flexion. So when they go to the bottom of a squat, they're eventually going to fall backwards if they don't have a counterweight. So having that heel lift or the wedge brings the center of gravity forward, so that when they get to depth, they don't feel like they're going to fall backwards. That's not a bad thing necessarily, but again, now you're shifting the stress anteriorly, which is going to load the knee and the quads more, which is not a bad thing, as long as that's either your intent or you're aware that that's the consequence of what you're doing, because everything has a primary consequence and a secondary or an unintended consequence. And if your goal is to get a squat to look good, and most people do squat better in a lifting shoe or with the heel wedge by that eye test, you have to be okay with the fact that now you're going to load the knee more. And in some cases, especially in rehab, that might be the goal. But as long as you know that is a possibility, then it's not a problem.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head, Doug, there. I think that was awesome. I think the only thing I would add, and just is always having that intent. Like the amount of butt wink that we would be okay seeing is going to vary between a loaded squat or kind of a more restful position like the counterweight squat that we do with so many people to kind of help them restore deeper ranges of hip flexion and help their back extensions relax. So like you said, having intent and knowing what are we trying to look for and what is our purpose of programming or choosing this type of movement pattern determines how much of these things we're kind of relatively okay seeing. Like, I don't want somebody, like I said, having that accordion movement with load because there's just way too much stress going through the spine. But if I have somebody with 5-pound weights in their hands and we do a counterweight squat just to help them get flexion, systemic flexion, then something that we're okay with. So just always understanding that there is this, it's never right or wrong or good or bad. There's just relative degrees as we move along the continuum from something that's more kind of rehab centric and positional focused versus more on the performance output end of things that, what we're going to see with that same movement pattern of a squat changes as we're moving along that continuum of the same movement pattern.
Yeah, I think that research that you spoke about early on, Doug, I think I remember you saying that even just the act of putting a weight onto your body causes a little bit of a butt wink, like reflexively. So of course we're talking about the bottom where there's like this massive change in your pelvic alignment. We're not looking for that, but there is some sort of amount that we almost do want relative to, like where is their home or their neutral is what we'll talk about. I mean, if you go from that extended position in the low back and you don't have any sort of change in that when you put load on yourself, you're probably going to be like less stable when you do get to lower in the squat to begin with. You're going to be less pressurized. We talk about in our course, we talk about the soda can analogy. If you don't open it, it's going to be pressurized. It'll be more stable. You can put, you'd stand on it and it won't crumble. So then I feel like this conversation almost goes back to like, what is the core supposed to be doing? Like, what is the core, or like, and it's all, of course, going to be contextually defined on like, how should the core be acting under loaded movement? And then also another thing to think about too is sometimes as coaches or therapists, we imagine that like what we're doing in the weight room might completely change how somebody acts on a field. And as I think, as most of us would agree, I don't think that's necessarily the case. I don't think like a lot of the things we're doing are that powerful. So if you're going to have an athlete in a loaded squat get to a bottom position, and like let's say they maintain like a large lumbar lordosis, and they stop before they butt wink and they go back up, like for their squat, like okay, that might not be the worst thing in the world, but maybe for their change of direction, that's not something we want. So we might want to work on that in the weight room, but it's also, if we allow a little bit of a butt wink, it's also not going to like completely detract from the person's athleticism on the field, where they're not all of a sudden, they're not going to be able to change direction if they're not, flexing their spine a little bit under a load. So yeah, it varies what our goal is. And I think, like you said, if the goal is like muscular strength and power or like endurance or whatever it is, like it doesn't really matter what we use as long as we're using an exercise that loads the muscles that we're trying to attack. Because again, we're not developing a skill necessarily. We're not going through a lateral change of direction type of thing or whatever that they might necessarily need on the field. We're going after a physiological change of how much output they can have under load. So it just goes back to, again, like what's the intent? And then, yeah, also going back to like intensity in general. Like if we're going to do a 1RM back squat, like I don't think we don't really do that, but like if you're going to do it and there's a fine line between like, all right, if I'm going to do a 1RM, like they kind of just have to push the weight and it might not really look the greatest, but you also shouldn't be okay with then like this massive undulation in the spine. So depends on the intensity, I think, as well. And then there's that gray area of like, all right, we kind of have to grind and push through some load to meet some goals. But where is that gray area of, too much spinal movement or too much butt winking? And then, like you said, if you just elevate the heels and it takes something away that you might not necessarily like, who cares if it's reaching achieving the goal that we're looking for?
I think there's two, like the butt wing thing is kind of like the discussion we had about the whole knees forward thing a few weeks ago about, it's like something that has kind of become really extreme in terms of how people look at it, that, that it's this aberrant movement pattern that is going to like really hurt somebody, when in reality, like we're kind of talking about, it's like just during a normal squat, putting a bar on, just holding a weight, like naturally you kind of get this reflexive movement. So there's certain things that I think naturally occur that when we don't understand, or maybe it's not that we don't understand, but we don't know that that's kind of a natural part of movement, then it becomes something that we spend too much time trying to correct instead of letting it occur and letting it become natural for people. So, like the reason we choose an anterior load is because it gets people's body to naturally kind of get into a more relatively neutral or mid-range position, because it gets them to kind of posterior pelvic tilt, closes off the front side of the rib cage, helps them push their knees forward while keeping their heels flat. Like it gets the movement pattern to be executed without us having to overcoach, versus like, if you have somebody with poor hip mobility, poor ankle mobility, and you give them a back squat, for them to achieve depth, they're going to have to butt wink more. And maybe if they're a power lifter or there's somebody that has to back squat, then yeah, maybe you're going to have to try to coach them out that, or do something to kind of fix that occurring with that strategy that you're giving them in terms of the back squat, versus maybe if we just gave them a different loading strategy, we're going to elicit the movement pattern execution that we're looking for. So I think there's a lot of things from an athletic movement standpoint as well, where people don't think that should be happening. So we try to coach people out of it versus naturally letting it happen, and letting the movement and the person kind of take care of itself, where we just kind of give them the task and let them try to figure it out. And their body's going to do what it can to figure out how to execute it as efficiently as possible for them and their individual constraints. So I just think that the butt winking and the knees forward thing, especially with squatting, is something that people spend a lot of time trying to correct, when maybe we shouldn't always be trying to correct that stuff. Or maybe we should just be choosing a different strategy rather than trying to coach them out of what they're currently doing.
Yeah, I mean, you need a posterior tilt to get into deep hip flexion. It basically unimpinges your hip and it buys you some more range of motion. I think that the line that we would probably draw is even in like a squat that we would do more for mobility and not loading, we want to see kind of more global flexion. Like we don't want to see somebody, we're not worried about them getting hurt. It's more like, what are we trying to train? We're trying to train a certain motor pattern. We want to see global flexion. And even in a relatively unloaded squat, we don't want to see just somebody like go down till they're like slightly below parallel, and then all of a sudden like they hinge or they unwind in one spot, which is usually like L4, L5, L5 less 1. In that counterweight squat, we want to see like them initiate the movement from more of a globally flexed position as they go down. And then in a loaded squat, we want to see, quote unquote, like not a lot of movement in the spine, something that looks more neutral. And again, we know that neutral is a construct and it's not like this pinpoint thing, but we see a lot of people like who they might do a low bar squat where they're taught to like not let their knees go forward at all. And the knees forward allows you to posteriorly tilt when you want to posteriorly tilt. It allows you to get into deeper hip flexion. If you're told, okay, like low bar squat, don't let your knees go forward. Now you're probably going to have to start that squat off in a more lumbar extended position. And now to get to a certain depth, because your pelvis is more anteriorly tilted, you're going to run out of hip flexion, and then you're going to have to bend somewhere. So now you bend, you basically like unbend at that one spot, which is usually somewhere in the lumbar spine. And that's probably where we draw the line. If we just see like a ton of movement in one spot and not like more of a global pattern. So again, it's easier to demonstrate this stuff when we can see videos and say like kind of yay or nay. But there are situations where I would say, like, look, if I'm coaching this person, I don't want them to start out in a massively extended position and then kind of like when they get to a certain depth, reverse it and, at one point. But sometimes like it's visually easier to demonstrate that than to speak in the abstract. But there's again this movement in the field where you can adapt to any kind of load and nothing is bad. And like I'm not even worried about people necessarily getting hurt. I can't prove to you that if people squat the way that we're advocating that they will or won't get hurt. It's just that we have a certain kind of aesthetic and standard for a variety of reasons, not just pain or injury, related to performance and how different shapes translate into athletic endeavors. And so there's a lot of reasons why we might choose a certain position or shape, not just related to injury. So we're not claiming like this is the way to prevent injuries, but we do draw boundaries and say like, if you're squatting a certain way and not meeting the standard, then it's either not an appropriate movement for you, or we're going to modify it to get you to hit the shapes that we want.
It's funny because, we're talking about like putting something under people's heels and how like, if you asked us that same question like 5 years ago, like people would argue about like, oh, well, everybody should be barefoot squatting and like nobody should have anything under their heels because it's like changing their environment and, you're going to change how they adapt and all this stuff. And it seems like now everything else in our field, like everything kind of comes back around and is retried again by a group of new people. And then you realize like, oh, there are some benefits to doing some of this stuff. And again, like it always just goes back to like, let's keep it real. And the goal should be the reason for what you're trying to achieve should direct what you do with somebody. And if somebody can squat without anything, with a bare foot and it looks beautiful and they get an awesome depth, like sweet. If they can't, then who cares? Let's give them a way that they can squat better where we can load them and achieve our goals.
And it's never either or, but again, I want people to, I don't want to be evasive. Like I want to answer people's questions, and it's always about like, well, what do you actually do with people? Because you could speak in the abstract and then no one learns anything. Like, would you guys?
Yeah, and that's where I would say like if I have somebody and I have them squat in like whatever shoe they come in, and it looks fine, then all right, cool. Totally. Yeah, like who the hell cares?
Here's a hypothetical scenario that I think is just kind of fun to play with. You have someone, you have them back squat in their regular training shoes. It doesn't look good. You put them under a wedge and it looks how you want it to look. Or instead of having them putting the wedge and back squatting, you have them do a front squat, Zercher squat, a front loaded squat, and now they hit the shape that you want. And again, it's not an either or, but for the sake of just fun in the discussion, like I personally would probably rather just front load them and not elevate their heel. I want people to ultimately squat and not need a heel lift. If they need it to meet the objective, then sure. But if, like, for example, I would rather have somebody do a front loaded squat and not need the heel lift than do a back squat and need a heel lift. That's just me. Like, what would you guys do there?
I would 100% agree with you. If you need help with a back squat, why not try a different position for the load? Because then you could, like you said, then if you don't need something, that's great. That's less help you need to do something, less assistance, you could think of it, where I think that's going to be better off for them in the long run. And then also, what was I going to say? I can't remember. Trevor, go ahead.
I would say the same thing. Obviously, I think we tend to agree on things, but yeah, like I want to give somebody as little constraints as they can to do whatever they need to be able to do. Like we talk, like we have a pretty good little metal wedge here that we use with people to help them get in different shapes and different positions. But ultimately, what if they don't have access to that? And I think something that kind of makes the movement pattern easier to learn and easier to execute on their own outside of their time with us, whether they're at the gym by themselves or at home in their home gym or whatever it is. I want to give them whatever's going to be easiest for them to execute safely on their own. And I would say 99% of the time, some sort of anterior loaded squat is typically what kind of lets people get into the shapes like you're talking about, Doug, that we want people to get into, that helps express these different ranges of motion. Because like for myself, because like especially with the team sport athletes that I work with, I want to see athletes dorsiflex. So I want them achieving a parallel shin and a parallel torso, and an anterior loaded squat is like the best way to help them do that, whether it's with a counterweight, whether it's a goblet, whether it's a double kettlebell, whether it's a Zercher. I don't really care what it is. I just want to give them something that helps them achieve the position that I know they have to be able to get into to be able to express force optimally on the field.
Yeah, and I don't even know if like what we're saying is the right answer. It's just what we do, and we're trying to be transparent. And ultimately, like, different people can come to different conclusions and still be logical. It depends on like, what are your underlying assumptions and what do you value? I suppose like if we valued, like, we just want to maximally load this pattern in the scenario that we just mentioned, you'd probably say, okay, we'll do the back squat and add a wedge, because I don't necessarily I don't value probably load as much as like a certain kind of aesthetic and idea of what I think something should look like. Now, I'm not even saying that's good. Maybe that's my bias, and maybe it's because like we're more PTs than strength coaches, and we're kind of like more influenced by like a biomechanical thought process, at least when it comes to performance, not necessarily pain. Then you would value the front squat, because if you want, like you said, parallel shins, parallel torso, yeah, like the front squat is going to do that without adding an additional implement. But if you valued load, then you would say, okay, like I want to, if load is your number one priority, then you do the back squat and a wedge. So again, the answer is contingent upon like, what do you value? And again, I would probably go with that front squat in that scenario, but a lot of times for reasons that I can't totally articulate in a very clear way.
And I think that, a lot of the people we work with, we're not working with 80% power lifters where like the load is the goal. Like a lot of the people we work with they're not like absolutely strong. We don't have the strongest people in the world who are always coming to us. Obviously some are more stronger than others, but you could probably load somebody with a similar load anteriorly as their back squat, let's say, or get even less of a load and have a similar benefit, because for them, like their strength isn't at the highest level that it can be compared to a power lifter. So you can still improve the qualities that you're trying to achieve without adding a wedge and giving them a better, alternative where you have to coach them less. They are going to be more compliant to what you want it to look like when they're on their own, which is, I think, a huge thing for us. Is we're trying to get people to do like very basic things well, like without us, and be independent. Yeah. So if they're going to require more tools with, more of a fine line for error, then we might be setting themselves up to, if it's for pain, they might they might continue to feel the pain that they're having. If it's for, sort of unlock some sort of performance goal, like they might still have that barrier because of all these little things that we have to add in to try and get them to do what we want.
What I would add too for that is like, with this kind of hypothetical scenario, it's like, if the goal is to get somebody to be able to just increase force production capabilities, the number one movement I personally would choose would just be a trap bar deadlift then. So, because again, it's not a barbell deadlift where, let's be honest, most people can probably deadlift more than they can squat. So if I'm just looking for a pure output standpoint, weight on the bar, weight that they're moving, I'm going to choose a trap bar deadlift, because again, it still kind of meets, and that's something we've been criticized for online a little bit, is that like our trap bar deadlift looks like a squat. And it's like, I don't care, because again, I'm the movement standards that I'm looking for people to be able to execute is a relatively parallel shin and a relatively parallel torso. That's kind of always what I'm looking for, regardless of the movement pattern or what they're doing. So if I'm looking to just increase somebody's ability to produce force, probably interested in a trap bar deadlift. It doesn't have the same eccentric component and the same range of motion requirements that a front squat or an anterior low does, but that's kind of a different quality that I'm going to be training with that. So I would pretty much always choose a trap bar deadlift for like my true pure strength movement, or power, or explosiveness, whatever you want to call it. Just depends on how you're loading it. But then I'm always going to be choosing some sort of squat pattern, because I like the eccentric component of it. I like the anterior core demands that it places on them, and just the way it gets them to express the movement with flexion occurring at the ankle, knee, and hip as they descend down. I think that's such an undervalued thing that makes a huge difference for people as they get better at controlling those positions.
Yeah, like with the trap bar deadlift, we've heard that criticism where people say, oh, like it's not enough of a hip hinge. It's like, well, how we teach the deadlift is very intentional. Like we're not trying to teach a pure hip hinge. We're encouraging people to let their knees go forward a little bit. So again, like doing a hip hinge isn't bad, but it's become like the default. Like if you deadlift and it's not a pure hip hinge, then it's not a good deadlift. But who says that's the rule? And Greg brought up like the 1 rep max scenario. Like if you're a power lifter and then you value winning a powerlifting meet, that's your number one priority. Of course, like if you have to deviate from things that we're saying to win and to compete, then do it, as long as you know what the consequences could be. And like most powerlifters that we work with, they're very aware like that this is, they're willing to put themselves at risk more from an injury standpoint, even if their technique is impeccable, whatever that means, like just because the amount of loads they're using and they're constantly, competing and doing 1RMs, like by virtue of just the load alone, you're more at risk for injury, forgetting the mechanical piece of it. So like if your priority is winning and you have to like go into a quote unquote butt wink or whatever, then like do it if that's important to you, as long as you know what the trade-offs are. But yeah, it just comes down to like what's your intent and what do you value. But when it comes to like 1RMs for like our setting, like I know we don't like speaking in absolutes. In a physical therapy, like rehab scenario, I would literally never 1RM somebody in probably anything. And even in a team sport athlete, I would never 1RM somebody. I'm not like a powerlifting coach. If I was a powerlifting coach, then I would, or I'd have them do like what, like the Russians call it, like the competition max versus training max. Like what's your max in training that isn't going to like arouse you beyond a certain level? But then I would push, I might have somebody in training do like, 90% of 1RM for like singles, but I would never outside of like working with a competitive strength athlete, say like, okay, I want you to go for broke here and show me what your true max is. I just, from a cost benefit standpoint, don't think that makes any sense.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. It's like even in the latest stages of getting somebody prepared for sport, especially like a team sport athlete we're talking about, not necessarily somebody whose sport is lifting. It's like I would never ever touch anything even close to a runner run, regardless of what the movement is. I just don't. There's way more risk than benefit, way more risk than reward in doing something like that.
Yeah, we're not load averse. We're just saying we wouldn't do 1 hour round.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think our sort of thought process on like, we don't really care, like we don't delineate things as like hip hinge or knee dominant. I think we care more about like hip flexion or hip extension. It's sort of how we break things down in like our course, for example. So if you think about it that way, then it kind of doesn't necessarily matter like how much of a squat it looks like and it's not like you're not using your hamstrings if you let your knees bend. Like you better friggin' be using your hamstrings if you're going to be lifting something heavy off the floor. So
that's something else too with when you teach somebody to like overuse movement at one joint, you put them off balance so much, so then their ability to like be an efficient and effective mover in whatever position you have like kind of put them in from the outside is kind of already throws off what they would naturally do in the first place. It's like the last thing I want somebody to feel when they're, squatting 400 pounds or pulling 400 pounds or whatever it is, something with like a substantial load, is them focusing on like pushing one part of their body like outside of the base of support. So then they have to fight with the rest of their body to keep themselves balanced and stop themselves from hurting themselves. So I think like when you try to overdo a hip hinge or you try to overdo like the knees forward or whatever it is, it doesn't even matter, what joint it is, but just overcuing like excessive movement in one joint, you throw away the natural distribution of stress across the body, which is always what we're looking for. And again, like we disrupt their ability to have balance, which if you're not balanced, there's no way you're going to move well, or there's no way you're going to be able to move as optimally or as efficiently or as effectively as you can.
Awesome. I think we beat that one up. We had a nice little bit of a tangent there. That was awesome. Thanks for listening to this Keep It Real Talk episode number 8. We hope you enjoy it. We're going to be continuing to do these where we have people come on and ask questions as become part of the discussion. So feel free to get the invites to come on. You'd have to join our mailing list, and then you'll see some emails pop through. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, we send out the Zoom meeting, details for you to log on. If you can't make it, you can always just send in some questions too, and just listen to the podcast the next week when it's released. So that's it for this week. You guys have anything else you want to add?
No, thanks everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
As a thank you for listening, we'd like to offer a 10% discount on all products at resilientperformance.com. Please use promo code PODCAST at checkout. That's PODCAST. And I also encourage you to sign up for our mailing list to receive exclusive articles only available by signing up. Thanks for listening.